So when I was 30, I went to work at a farm. It wasn't a typical farm. It was part of a wonderful organization called the Food Project. And in addition to growing fresh vegetables for low-income neighborhoods in Boston that didn't have access, this farm had the mission of growing leadership of teens from the city and suburbs, and of linking them together to each other and to the land. I love this job, and one summer I gave a tour to a group from Oakland. And we walked across the field, we zigzagged through the plots of corn and squash and cucumbers, and when we got to their side, and most people filed into the greenhouse, I noticed that there was a person standing back, an African-American woman who had turned to face the way that we had come. And curious, I went to stand next to her, and I noticed for the first time that there was a little hill that made this the best spot with which to view the whole farm. And I could see the 30 acres we had just crossed. I could see the stone wall, very New England stone wall, and the trees in the distance. And through the trees, I could catch a glimpse of the new 10 acres that we had just begun to farm. It was a beautiful day, so I just paused to take it in. And we stood there on the hill for a few moments, not saying anything. But when she spoke without turning her head. She said, "It's so big. It's so much land. I've never seen what 40 acres looked like before. I've never seen what my ancestors were promised but never received." I thought, how could I have missed that? Looking out at that 40 acres now, I had a feeling of an ache for what could have been and what should have been. Now, her words were bringing me back, recalling a moment in time after an unimaginably ugly history of enslavement, when there was this glimmer of hope. In 1865, right at the end of the Civil War and the dawn of emancipation, Union General William Sherman and President Lincoln's Secretary of War came down to Savannah and actually sat down with a group of 20 black ministers and listened to their vision of the future. And it was actually a bold and comprehensive vision that they presented, and land was at the centerpiece. One of the ministers was Reverend Garrison Frazier, who had spent 60 years in slavery. And this is what he told two of the most powerful men in the nation. He said, "The best way we can care for ourselves is to have some land and to turn it and till it by our own labor. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare." And incredibly, that vision, that idea to give each freed family 40 acres and a mule, was approved by President Lincoln and administered by General Sherman. And for a while, it was promising. Imagine what might have happened had the masses of people emerging from bondage been able to have some property and some land and pass that on to their children. As a biracial African American, it's not so hard for me to imagine. That's the promise of the American dream that my white ancestors arriving from Ireland and Germany were able to hold on to. And I don't think it would have changed everything. Wouldn't have solved everything, but it would have been the foundation of a much more just and equal society. The death of Abraham Lincoln shifted the balance. The government's commitment to that vision collapsed. The Ku Klux Klan rode into that vacuum. Jim Crow laws were passed, and 4 million African Americans were trapped into a system of sharecropping. And so instead of reaping the benefits of their own labor and their agricultural acumen, they faced a constant threat of violence and a cycle of debt that locked them into poverty. And that's the legacy we have with us today. So when I stood on that hill, I realized that the food crisis that we were fighting in Boston and in Oakland and other places was really just a symptom of a much deeper problem and a much deeper failure of justice. And seeing that 40 acres, I could more clearly see what had been lost, and it was heartbreaking. And it haunted me, and it haunts me to this day. But if it's the pain that sometimes keeps me up at night, it's the possibility that gets me up in the morning. Because also grasping, glimpsing that possibility of the past reminded me that each moment has the potential to make the future profoundly different. And knowing that someone in the future, a young woman, would look back at our time and at us and either have a sense of profound disappointment or profound fulfillment, forced me to ask this question: what would it mean to have a vision of the food movement that is as deep as the problem? How can we break through big structural problems with bold structural solutions? And from my experience, I believe that there are three essential elements to that deep vision. They are land, leadership, and linkages. So the first is land. And by land, I mean having as much land in as many hands as possible, not fewer. Right? Many people in this room are doing great, amazing work around the distribution of food. And I believe as a movement, we can't lose sight of the distribution of land. Saving family farms and expanding that base of who has land will expand the base of who has wealth and the means of self-sufficiency. And there's so many beautiful things happening around this all over the country. Not far from here, in outer Brooklyn, a group of neighbors has turned a bunch of vacant lots into a set of vibrant gardens. And many of those neighbors actually are descendants of freed people who never lost that vision. Right? They've turned into these vibrant gardens that also anchor a community market. That's called the East New York Farms Project. Across the country, all the way across the country, in Hawaii, on the Waianae coast of Oahu, land that was once communally owned by the Hawaiian people and was taken from them, has been reclaimed by the community. And the Ma'o Farms is now the largest producer of organic food in the state of Hawaii. Just as importantly, it is a source of employment for young people from the community, and it is a source of pride in culture and tradition. So the second element is leadership. And by leadership here, I'm talking about leadership from the ground up, not the top down. Nothing is more transformative than when communities, not corporations, are in full say of their own future. And that's especially true when it's the communities that have been most marginalized by racism and economic exploitation and other systems of oppression can lead the solutions and lead the change. There's a wonderful example, I think many of you know right now, in southern Florida, the tomato pickers. Until recently, the farm workers who harvested the bulk of tomatoes in the US had no say in their wages and working conditions. And that led inevitably to wage theft, sexual harassment, injury. Modern-day slavery was not unknown. And that has changed substantially. It's changed with a long campaign and the advent of the Fair Food Program. What the Fair Food Program does is put workers in the driver's seat of ensuring safety and dignity in the fields, and gave them the first pay raise that they had in 30 years. And what's key here is that the success of that program is that it was imagined, designed, and led by the workers themselves based on their own experience, and that it was supported by a strong coalition of consumers, churches, and students that stood behind them, stood strong behind them. So the third element is linkages. By linkages, I'm talking about linking between even seemingly separate causes. A brilliant example is happening right here in New York State. with Milk Not Jails. The organizers of Milk Not Jails recognize that as upstate New York loses farms and as rural communities and economies begin to collapse, those communities are forced to depend more and more on prisons for jobs. Prisons which warehouse people from Black and Latino neighborhoods and communities whose own economies have collapsed. So Milk Not Jails is revitalizing that dairy industry through a marketing cooperative, and at the same time speaking out and working against mass incarceration. I think we are so much more connected than we realize. These three elements, land, leadership from the ground up, linkages, they're not everything. But I think they're essential to a deep vision. What we're really talking about is building a real food future. By real food, I mean food which truly actually nourishes people, both consumers and producers. It nourishes communities and the earth. And when we talk about food justice, what we're really talking about is social justice, using food, which is our most intimate connection to ourselves and to our communities and our cultures and the earth, as a powerful lever to achieve it. If we're successful, we won't just change the way that we eat. We'll change the way that we live and the way that we treat each other. Now, I invite you to imagine yourself standing on a hill, facing out at 40 acres, fully aware of a painful, heartbreaking past, but also seeing a field of bold, beautiful possibilities in front of you. And I believe that if we can root ourselves in history and draw from those roots a vision that is even bigger than our problems, and if we stay committed to that vision together, we can deliver on the promise of our moment. Thank you.